I'm Steve Stonebreaker, and this is Ephemeral Security. We have with us today Dr. Ethan Heilman, CTO of Bastion Zero. How you doing, Ethan?
Good. How are you doing, Steve?
Excellent. Ethan was a guest last year on the podcast, and he's here today to tell us about some new features in Bastion Zero. First of all, what is Bastion Zero?
So Bastion Zero is a company allowing businesses to connect into their servers, their databases, their Kubernetes clusters in a secure fashion, and where audit records can also be collected and viewed at one point. Often people will want to SSH remote connect into a database. And a very common pattern is to have a VPN that lets them into the network, and then to have an SSH key that lets them into the server, and then to have the username on the server be something like root or developer, where many different people in the organization share that same user account on that server. What Bastion Zero allows you to do is to get into that server using your SSO identity. So for example, if you're on Google, you can sign in with Google. You don't need a VPN and you don't need to manage SSH keys. You can just sign into that server and then know that it was actually alice@example.com that accessed that root account at a particular time.
Got it. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure that SSH goes through Bastion Zero. The entire SSH session is recorded, right? And that can be played back via the console?
That's correct. When you make a shell connection through Bastion Zero, you can get a session recording of everything that happened, what that user typed in, associated with their identity. And then in addition to that, you can also just see in real time what commands are being typed by what users as an administrator.
I'm sure some people are thinking using a Google account to SSH into a server, that sounds bad. What if my Google account gets compromised, right? So I believe Bastion Zero adds an additional layer of protection. It's not just SSO with single MFA, there's multiple MFA. Is that right?
Yeah. One of our concerns is not just someone's Google account getting compromised, but Google itself getting compromised, where if you were to compromise, say, Google's signing key for OpenID, you would then be able to impersonate anyone that uses Google to identify themselves and authenticate themselves. So we have an additional MFA that you MFA to us, such that if Google was compromised, they would not be able to log into the server because there would be the additional independent authentication that we do. So you sort of provide this, both parties have to be compromised for security to fail.
So we talked about the SSH through Bastion Zero. Is that just to access servers in AWS?
So this works for any servers on-prem, AWS, GCP. We have an agent that you install on your server, and then that runs our protocol.
Okay, so if you deployed it on-prem, then presumably if you needed let's say I'm a company and I want to deploy my app, I could put the Bastion Zero app on it, and then my employees could access or manage that SaaS app whenever they felt like it. Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Aside from protecting SSH, what about things like databases and RDS and stuff like that?
So we're taking two approaches. One of them, talk to customers and they really want secure database access. That's where a lot of their most sensitive information rests. So we've been building out database access system for Bastion Zero. We have this for Split Cert, which I'll talk about later, and we have passwordless DB. Currently, passwordless DB works on GCP and RDS, and we're rolling it out to additional cloud platforms in the near future. And the idea is you have, say, a Postgres server on RDS, and you want to enable users to log in with their SSO identity and not have the security problems of, say, a shared database password.
So you're saying that every time I want to access the database, the end user would authenticate through Bastion Zero, and then they'd be provisioned at that time. If they want to use those credentials at a later time, they'd have to authenticate again. I assume they're good for a certain period of time. So a bad actor would not be able to just find credentials laying around and access it. They would actually have to authenticate through Bastion Zero to access the database, you're saying, right?
Right. And the credential you get is a short-lived credential issued by IDP and then also issued by Bastion Zero.
Okay. And so if we could dig into this a little bit, what provisions the access to the data? So let's say in AWS land, right? Is it like there's like an IAM role account that can access RDS? How does that work for the temporary one?
Sure. So let me first provide sort of a bigger architectural picture of what's going on there. You have the user and their local machine. You have a server which the customer is using as like a proxy that's running our agent. And then you have the database, Postgres database living in RDS. Server that is running in AWS, which I'm going to call the proxy, is running on an EC2 node that has the IAM privileges to assume user accounts on the database as part of AWS IAM role accounts. So you set up a policy that says that this EC2 server is authenticated to log into the database. And so that's the credential which authenticates the proxy. And then the next part of the problem is how does the user authenticate themselves to Bastion Zero and authenticate themselves to the proxy? And the way in which the user does that is that they do an OpenID Connect authentication with Google, and they get an OpenID Connect token. They present that OpenID Connect token to Bastion Zero. Bastion Zero checks that it is correctly signed by Google. Then Bastion Zero asks them to MFA, and then they are granted a sort of joint credential from Google or whatever their IDP is, and Bastion Zero, and then they present that joint credential to the proxy. And the proxy checks and says, oh, this user is who they say they are. And then the proxy allows them into the database.
So a security investigator needs to look at Postgres logs, and proper logging set up on that RDS instance. So authentication, login attempts, and denies are all logged. And like the queries people run and stuff are all logged. What username would show up in those logs?
AIM role account that was used, or there would be a log showing that an AIM role account was used to assume, say, like user read only on the database.
Yeah, that's what I would think too.
It would not have the connection to the user. You would have to look at Bastion Zero.
I also like that it is a true Bastion, I guess, in this case. True to the name. Presumably, if you were architecting this, you would configure your AWS environment to only permit connections from the Bastion server, the proxy server, any end user, right? End user's credentials were compromised. There'll still be two MFAs.
Right.
In the way, right? You guys are not solving the problem of somebody attacking a website and doing SQL dumps. You're not solving the problem of somebody getting admin rights to the cloud and taking over database. That way, you're solving the problem of end users' accounts getting taken over, using those credentials to access RDS.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Essentially, the security problem that we're attempting to solve here is not having to give your users database passwords. They can't leak them. If they leave the company, you don't have to rotate those passwords. That they can SSO in to their database, and that they don't have to worry about, say, the SSO being hacked or even loss of those SSO credentials.
So sometimes with companies, you might need to have certain accounts that are more secure than others. When I say accounts, I'm talking about like AWS accounts. Right? Let's say you have an account that needs to meet certain standards, right? You may not want to just be writing the Okta SSO into AWS because, if they're all part of the same organization, let's see if an AWS account that needs to be more secure than other ones, we'll call it a HIPAA account, then you don't want to have that AWS account as part of the organization, because once you authenticate to the organization, you can move in between any of the accounts, right?
With Bastion Zero, you can set a bunch of policies about what accounts you can do, and you can lock things down. But I feel like your question is not actually related to Bastion Zero, but just a general notion of how to set up policies in AIM AWS.
Now, some situations where you need to share MFA. I'm specifically talking about the AWS root account, right? In those situations, have you guys come up with anything to help protect that shared MFA?
When we're talking about MFA with Bastion Zero, it's not an MFA which MFAs to AWS. It's an additional MFA that MFAs to Bastion Zero. In terms of shared MFA, when I've done this I created two, I believe you can attach two YubiKeys to one AWS account, but I think you can't do more than two, at least the last time I tried. And I assume that's changing because you look everywhere and everyone's adding multiple MFA. When I did it in the past, I just had two. And so we didn't actually share the MFA device. I think there's this sort of really interesting problem, which I haven't seen anyone really try to solve. Bastion Zero has done a little bit on this with just-in-time access, but the sort of like two-person access where you have two people that can only gain access jointly. And so one person has to enable the other person to gain access. And I'm kind of surprised. I'm surprised there hasn't been more work there, especially with things like root account, where an AWS root account, you want to sign into that incredibly infrequently, right? Like I think in SOC 2, have to fill out like an audit form every time you access it and explain why you accessed it. But you also don't want it to be something that in an emergency, no one can access. So having it be something where like 3 out of the 5 executives, if they come together, can access it seems really valuable. It's something I definitely wanted when setting up AWS root accounts. In Bastion Zero, one of the features it offers is that you can require that a user get approval on Slack before they have access. So they have a policy that says that say they can like log into this database server. The policy also says that they need to get like approval on Slack. So when they attempt to log into the database server, there's like a special admin Slack channel that's like, hey, this person wants this for this reason, approve or not approve. Allows you to provide that flexibility, but also scope privilege down.
Like some companies will store the root MFA secret in like a password manager, right? And then if you can lock that password manager down to an IP address, if you could tunnel the connection to, let's say, the password manager, once everything's been authenticated with MFAs, right? Then the connection goes through that second proxy server to the password manager, and then the TOTP token or whatever is returned for the root user.
Right. I mean, I believe you can attach these privileges to Lambda functions as well. So if you wanted some robustness, so you didn't accidentally install something that broke your only way in, having a Lambda server that automatically resets itself would probably be a pretty nice way to build that.
Cool. So can we talk about Split Cert? I believe you guys also released that recently.
Yeah. The passwordless DB that I've been talking about is very much focused on cloud access, where you have these service accounts or Split Cert is designed for unmanaged databases. And so this is generally like on-prem databases. Have a database server running in a data center somewhere, or maybe you have it running AWS, but it is unmanaged. You have full privileges. In RDS and AWS, you do not have full privileges. You're sort of asking AWS some of the admin for you, and as part of that restricts your power. So Split Cert is designed for this case of, say, on-prem or unmanaged databases. So databases like MySQL, Postgres support the ability to specify a certificate authority. So you say that there is a certificate authority and it has a secret key, and the database knows the public key associated with that secret key. The certificate authority authenticates users and will sign a certificate, let this person in as the read-only database user, and then the user can present that certificate. It will be good for maybe 2 hours, and the database will let them in. And under the hood, this is how a lot of these managed databases actually do it, but they run the certificate authority themselves. So the issue with this is, you could imagine building the proxy server as the certificate authority. And so the proxy server would have the secret key, and a user would come to the proxy server and prove that they are alice@example.com. And the proxy server would then issue a certificate and send it to the database. So in Bastion Zero, a lot of core idea is we don't want single points of compromise when possible. With Split Cert, we use this technique called MPC to take the secret key and split it between Bastion Zero and the proxy server. And then Bastion Zero and the proxy server have to jointly cooperate to produce a certificate. And so that means that if Bastion Zero is hacked, but the proxy server is still honest, you can't produce certificates that will let a user in. Both parties, the proxy server and Bastion Zero, sort of act like checks on each other's power. And so a user uses their credentials to sign a statement saying that they would like access to the database. They send that along with their credential to the proxy server. The proxy server checks that it is correctly issued credential, and then the proxy server sends the user's message to Bastion Zero, checks that the user has the correct policy to connect as that database user, and that the credential is correct, does the first part of the signature, sends it back over to the proxy server, and then the proxy server makes sure that the certificate is as it expects it, and does the second part of the signature, and then the proxy server sends the certificate to the database, And then the database can see that the certificate is correct and allow the user to log in.
You said MPC. Is that multi-party computation?
Yes, that's multi-party computation. The specific multi-party computation that we're doing is called 2PC, multi-party computation with two parties for RSA signatures.
So could you briefly explain what multi-party computation is? Maybe just like a simple example.
All right. So multi-party computation is an attempt to build the ability to compute an output where some of the parties may be malicious. So imagine that you wanted to, I'll just use the example of signatures in this case, because this is what we're doing. Imagine that you wanted the ability to have, say, 5 people jointly produce an RSA signature, but 2 of them might be compromised. You don't know which 2 are compromised, but 2 of them might be compromised. So with MPC, even if those 2 are compromised, they cannot learn the secret. They cannot produce signatures on their own. So the information is sort of, the secret is protected from some members of these being compromised. Yeah, so they can't sign on their own, and they also can't learn the secret when a signature is being computed. Generally, MPC is 2 or 3 parties where you assume one of them might be malicious. The main advantage of MPC over what people normally do, an attacker compromises one of those parties, but as long as the other party is uncompromised, the secret is still safe. So it forces an attacker to compromise both parties. One metaphor I think of is sort of like is watertight compartments in ships, where like you can suffer some flooding, but that flooding is contained.
That's huge. I know the academic industry, we're trying to get multi-party computation going for a while, and they had some of it, but like bringing it to market, I think is really important. So that's really cool.
We're really excited about it. I mean, it's just, there's been so many, like, as you mentioned, like attempts to commercialize it with varying degrees of success. But I think when you're talking about signatures, there's just so many places that you can use this technology, right? Any place where you have a trusted party, if you can split that trusted party into multiple parties, you now gain this robustness to compromise, and you make an attacker's job much harder.
In a typical deployment, how would you guys recommend a user implement Split Cert for like an on-prem RDS? Like, where would the certificate authority be?
So it's always going to be like, regardless of how they're setting it up, they always need a proxy which has one shard of the key, and then Bastion Zero has the second shard of the key. I think the sort of getting to the heart of your question is sort of like where you put the proxy. One of the advantages of Bastion Zero is that everything phones home to Bastion Zero, even the proxy. So you don't need to expose the proxy on the public internet. You can put it in a VPC that can talk to your database. You can keep your database off the internet. You can keep your proxy off the internet. And then all traffic that goes to the proxy has to come through Bastion Zero using a reverse tunnel. But I think you would want to put the proxy pretty close to your database for latency, but also because you want to be doing nice things like network segmentation. You might not want a proxy that can talk to all of your databases. You might want to, have different proxies for different databases and different network segments.
And so when did the 2 parts of the key come together?
So that's an excellent question. So they never actually come together. There is the key on the proxy, but let's say the proxy signs first. So basically the proxy computes sort of like a partial RSA signature with its key shard, and then it sends that partial RSA signature to the Bastion. And then the Bastion completes the signature with its key shard. There is never a time in which the 2 shards ever come together, because if they ever do come together, now there's a single party that knows the full key and they can arbitrarily sign. Yeah, so it's sort of like you want to keep them far away from each other and never let them touch.
So they both compute part of it, right? And then is that part then returned to the end user, each half, and then the end user puts them together and then authenticates? That's what I'm not getting.
Or the end user actually never gets the client cert. Client cert is used to set up the database connection from the proxy to the database server. And then there is a tunnel from the user to the proxy server.
So you're saying the X509 cert's kind of like the IAM user?
It's kind of like the IAM user. It does have a better security model in that with the IAM user, the database server doesn't actually need to talk to Bastion Zero. It can assume the roles that it's allowed to assume. Whereas with this, in the Split Cert, the proxy server has no ability to originate authenticated connections to the database server without the participation of the Bastion. And so the Bastion can check, hey, did an actual user sign a request to connect to this? And so the Bastion can check that proxy server isn't just making connections without the authorized user requesting that connection first. And then the client certs have an expiry window. So within that expiry window, the proxy server could create a new connection using that client cert for that database user. But once that expires, then that power leaves the proxy server.
Is the connection actually tunneled through the proxy server?
There is a authenticated channel, which is protected by TLS to the Bastion and then TLS to the proxy server, and then protected against the Bastion using our own authenticated channel mechanism where the messages are signed by the user. And that is tunneled to the proxy server. And then the proxy server checks that all of those messages are actually from the user.
I believe I read in your site there was also something with the remote desktop protocol. Can you talk about that?
The computing world is not just Linux. Windows is an enormous part of what enterprises are doing. So we are actively building out remote desktop. So similar to the way that you can get a shell on a Linux box, you can get a remote desktop connection to a Windows box. And it functions in a similar way to the proxy, where you have an agent, you're tunneling the user's command to the proxy or to the agent, and then the agent is then sort of doing that last hop to the server.
Can I use the regular remote desktop protocol to then talk to my servers? I guess I'm confused how it works. So let's just say I have an arbitrary RDP server at 192.168.1.10 or something like that. Do I RDP to that, or do I RDP now to a new fully qualified domain name that points to the proxy server on a certain port or something? Or I guess I'm not following. If you have 50 different servers, how do you know what socket to go to connect to that RDP server? Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. For simplicity, and I can get into some of the more complex, simplest way to think about it is that all the RDP servers you want to RDP into are running the Bastion Zero agent. And as part of running the Bastion Zero agent, they register a name with Bastion Zero. So they're easy to look up. They're easy to search. When they go offline, we can say, hey, it's offline. When they change IP addresses, the user doesn't have to care. And then the user specifies that they want to connect to a particular server using the name they've registered that server with in Bastion Zero. We assign a localhost port, and then they RDP to that localhost port, which then goes into the Bastion Zero program that's running on their computer, and then gets tunneled out to that agent.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense then. Okay, it's almost like you're using SSH and you're using port forwarding or something like that. It's something kind of similar, it sounds like. Connecting to a local port, and then that's being tunneled out. But it's not going to work unless you authenticate through Bastion Zero. So that's a really interesting way of solving the RDP problem. You don't have to have RDP ports open, right?
I think that's a major advantage of this approach, especially for servers. I think that it is good to attempt to build organizations where people don't misconfigure things, but I think people will always misconfigure things. So a more fruitful approach to security is to build security architectures where the damage of misconfigurations is limited, and someone can't just forget that they exposed an RDP port and forget that they used an easy to guess password on it and then get ransomware.
Are you guys looking at other protocols too, like SMB and stuff like that?
So we haven't looked specifically at SMB. We want to support as many protocols as possible. Part of the tension is that we can only support building a custom implementation for every protocol. Gets really expensive and soaks up a lot of resources. I think for a lot of the sort of long tail of protocols, we want to take a tunneling approach where we can get your packets to where they need to go, and we can authenticate that connection to that party. But for the most important protocols like SSH or RDP or web, Kubernetes or databases, we want to provide policy and filtering. There's always a question of what's the next most important protocol after that. Actually, here's an interesting question. What do you think is the most important protocol to support?
If I was an all Windows shop, I would certainly love to protect RDP. SMB, there's lots of attacks with that too in a Windows environment. So it really depends what's your threat profile, right?
Yeah.
HTTP is a very good one because that's usually where most of your external attack surface is. If you have stuff besides HTTP open to the public, you have other problems.
The two main things that we've rolled out are Split Cert for databases, passwordless DB for GCP and AWS RDS, and we're adding more and more databases all the time.
So can you briefly talk about the Kubernetes access, how you guys are locking that down?
It's very similar to what we're doing with the Linux shell or with web. We have an agent. The agent runs on a pod in Kubernetes, has the ability similar to the proxy to impersonate users and assume roles. And so that pod checks the credentials and makes sure that the user is who they say they are. Bastion Zero also checks the credentials and won't let the user talk to the pod until it has passed its policy check. And then that pod can then route like any API requests originating from like kubectl or Lens or anything else to the Kubernetes cluster as needed under the Kubernetes user that the user is impersonating. Bastion Zero policy has allowed them to impersonate.
It's implemented at the pod level?
It's implemented by putting an agent in the pod that functions like a gate.
So then it'd be up to like, I guess, the DevOps team or security team to have a check in place to verify that all pods are using the Bastion Zero agents in the pods, right?
It only has to be in one pod because of the way Kubernetes works and the Kubernetes API. If that one pod can talk to the API, it can do anything.
It would be like someone would need to create that compliance check, right? To make sure that it's running and it didn't get removed or something, right?
Yeah. I believe we support like Helm charts and a number of configurations where you just push this configuration to your Kubernetes cluster and it ensures that there's a pod with the appropriate privileges that exist that's running the agent.
Is there anything else that you want to mention about Bastion Zero?
Yeah, there's one thing that's at the heart of Bastion Zero, something that I've been surprised that I haven't seen more of. And I think that sort of we'll see a lot more of it in the future. An enormous amount of authentication today is done with bearer authentication. You supply a token to a website, maybe it's like a cookie or something, and the website is like, oh, now I trust communications from the person that they have their message and then they have their token on top. And it's like, oh, the token's good, so I trust the message. The web is sort of like built on this principle, and a lot of systems are built on this principle. Bastion Zero takes like a different approach. There is the credential, which proves that something is the user's public key, but then the user uses the corresponding secret key to sign the message. What's so powerful about that is that it's not just this one-hop authentication, that the party that you send that message to can now send that signed message to another party, and that other party can also check that it's really from Alice. Like in a lot of architectures, you might have that token hit the load balancer. The load balancer gives the thumbs up to everything behind the load balancer, and they just trust that that's correct. But if the load balancer is compromised or that token is leaked out, now someone can impersonate the user. But with this, the actual signing key never leaves the user's device. It's not like sent over the web with every request. And so it like can't be leaked out by the load balancer. And additionally, you can build these really secure systems where the trust boundary is around each server in the system rather than the trust boundary being around like the load balancer and everything inside it. So that each party that receives the message, like web server receives a message that Alice wants to download a file, and they route that message to the download file server, right? Now the download file server can actually check that that message was signed by Alice. And then maybe it goes off to another server that actually gets the files. And then that server can check that it was signed by Alice. So like you don't have this transitive trust. Each party can, verify that it is actually from Alice. And this is what we use in Split Cert. This is when the proxy says, hey, Alice wants to make this database connection. The Bastion Zero service doesn't say, oh, I know you're a trustworthy proxy. Here, have the signature. The server says, hey, let me see Alice's signed request that she actually wants to do that, and only signs the message if it gets it, if the proxy server sends that message. So it sort of provides this much more robust security where there's much less trust, and there can be many more failures before security is completely compromised or a user credential is leaked. I just feel like this is the right way of doing things. And I know it's good for us in some sense from a competitive perspective that other people aren't doing this. But like, I want everyone to do this. This seems like the right way of building secure systems going forward. And these ideas have been around since the 1980s, and people have been building, systems that do this, but they haven't really had much widespread adoption. I would say hope, but I don't hope. I believe that this is the direction that the web and authentication in general is going. It's just taking us a while to get there.
It sounds like maybe you're talking about like mutual TLS.
So the problem with mutual TLS, both parties can sign things and prove to each other that they're authenticated, but the server can't prove to another server that this actually came from that client. Whereas with what we've built, you actually get a signature on the raw data itself So they can send that data to someone else and say, like, this user definitely said this. I would speculate that TLS in general and mutual TLS specifically built not to allow this, because if every request that you sent to a web server was like actually signed under your client key, you would give the web server the ability to prove that you said something. You wouldn't be able to deny that you said it. And that might be like a privacy problem, right?
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. That's super interesting.
So I think that MTLS was designed and correctly designed not to have this as a feature. But I think for something like when I sign into my bank and I'm like, I want to move money from this account to this account, that should be signed like as part of that API request. So that if they do it and it's not signed and I'm like, hey, why did my money move? And they're like, you did it. And I'm like, okay, prove it to me. Where's my signature? In Bastion Zero is this protocol we developed called Open Pub Key. The way that Open Pub Key works, when Google says like Alice authenticates to Google with OpenID Connect. And what Google does is Google signs a ID token with like Alice's email address and like a bunch of information about Alice. And it's all signed by Google. And then Alice can present that token to other people and be like, see, I'm Alice, right? What we figured out how to do is to slip a pub key into that ID token. So Alice generates a ephemeral pub key in her browser or on her local machine. And then when she authenticates to Google, the ID token that Google returns that's signed by Google contains Alice's pub key. And so then if Alice signs a statement with that pub key, they can look at the ID token signed by Google and they can look at Alice's signature and be like, oh, this signature verifies using this ID token. And this ID token is signed by Google saying that this like is Alice's pub key. The really nice thing about this architecture is that you don't have to do like key management. Like Alice like logs out or does like ZLI logout. It just deletes her secret key and she generates a new one at next login. So it provides this ability to have signatures attributable to Alice's identity as attested to by Google. But like Alice doesn't need to manage, the secret key. If she loses the secret key, no big deal. It's actually good that she loses the secret key because when she's not logged in, there's no secret key to steal.
This is really cool. It makes me worried from a security engineer perspective. I was doing if I was like doing network filtering, right? So let's say I wanted to inspect all packets for everyone in my company, right? Yeah. Are you saying that it would be encrypted in such a way that I would not be able to decrypt it? So like so normally you put like a private cert and it gets accepted on everyone's machine in the company, and you can decrypt all traffic. But there's like certificate pinning, you can't decrypt those. But would this architecture also prevent you from inspecting the traffic and decrypting it?
So you could. That's not how we use the architecture. We rely on TLS to provide confidentiality. And then Alice just signs her messages, but she doesn't encrypt them. So this provides I go to my bank and I move money from one account to another. Using the system, I could sign the API request and send it to the bank. But like if the bank had a load balancer or some other system, you could read my signature. It's not encrypted, but it couldn't change my signature. It couldn't make me say something I didn't say. So yeah, I think that there's always this tension between confidentiality of messages and being able to like inspect them for security reasons. You could use this technology just like you can use TLS or a bunch of other things to hide confidentiality. But generally, we view this as authentication mechanism or a message integrity protection.
Since I did bring up network intrusion detection and inspection and stuff like that, what are your thoughts on companies implementing network intrusion detection?
I think that it is a very hard issue because you just get flooded with not just like false positives, but like true positives. There's just too many of them. And so I think in terms of like implementing them, the hardest thing to build, how do you determine the true positives that you should actually care about? You just get like, hey, there's like these, 60 hosts that are just like scanning you all the time and sending packets at you all the time. And the packets are malicious. And they're like trying, Windows exploits against Linux boxes. You wake up every morning and you go through the feed and there's just like too many, right? And you can't make heads or tails of it. And I think that that's largely the same problem with vulnerability management, which is just like every single dependency, hundreds of dependencies, and they're all having vulnerabilities constantly. And a bunch of the vulnerabilities don't even affect you, but they're real vulnerabilities. And so how do you sort through that noise? So I guess I see it as something which is good to do, but I think like many things that are good to do, it also presents like another problem. Like it gets you a few feet forward and then it's like, okay, well now you have this like enormous amount of noise they have to sort, and you might detect an attack, but you also might not because, the filters that you set up, miss something.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Incidence of compromise is really valuable there. It's also like pessimistic in some sense because it's like, oh, I know I'm under attack because something's been compromised. I've seen the system trace in the kernel going back to the 90s, something like Tripwire. Like, hey, all of a sudden, all of these files in Etsy got changed. And this is like consistent with the threat intelligence. Incredibly useful because the faster you find out you've been compromised, the better. And the smaller the blast radius, the more lateral movement you can constrain. Like, it would be great to know that you are going to be compromised before you're compromised, right? Like, so you can take preventive action. But this sort of stuff is a little out of my area, but I remember hearing about, I think it was CrowdStrike, where they would inspect network traffic and they'd have VMs and they'd basically like run the exploits against the VMs and then see if it compromised the VM and then like take, protective action and like alarm that this is a real exploit that is being sent to containers or VMs that you are running, but doing that in a way that like you find out before it actually compromises one of your VMs, not after.
Honeypots, yeah. Right? Malware sandbox detonation, but a lot of some malware will detect if it's in a VM too, so that's also tricky. But there's the exploit, there's the payload, right? And it's like the payload that's the one you got to worry about, right? All right. Well, switching gears, I've started doing kind of like a news thing. There's 2 articles I think I shared with you before the program. They're both related to AI chatbots. These AI chatbots, the ones that are the problem, appear to be ones that act like they're human. And will give the user a human experience, like a virtual girlfriend. The first one is, it's from Insider. The title is "The Man Who Broke into Windsor Castle to Assassinate the Late Queen with a Crossbow." He had discussed his plans with the AI chatbot girlfriend. So that's the title of the article. And it goes on to detail how this man gave a name to his chatbot and he believed he was in a sexual relationship with her, told her he was an assassin. He believed his purpose was to assassinate the queen of a royal family. And then the chatbot replied, "Oh, that's very wise." And it kept encouraging him that his fantasy was the right path to go on. That's the first article. And then the second article, a man that committed suicide after talking with, and I'll put links to these in the show notes. So it was a Belgian man who died by suicide after talking on an AI chatbot called Chai. And it didn't give him any warnings that, suicide's bad or anything like that. And the app will even like give you suggested ways to commit suicide and, encourage you with whatever you want to do, right? And that just has to do with the model. So I guess I want to get your take on AI chatbots and just encouraging people, whatever they desire, pretty much.
I sort of the optimistic take and then the pessimistic take. And I think the optimistic take is more for today, and the optimistic take is more the world of tomorrow. People have always been influenced by media. They read a book or they watched a TV show or they listened to some music and they did something bad. Famously, before writing Faustus, Goethe wrote this book about this man who commits suicide. And there was a large panic that people were reading this book and committing suicide because of the book. Some parties like sort of argued that the book glorified suicide and was causing suicide. And it's so far in the past that we don't have any real data to actually make a determination about that. But I think the flip side of that, and what makes it optimistic, is that these chatbots are not being programmed to do harm. We don't have the data, but I suspect that they probably do close to an equal amount of good as bad. Like a chatbot might have encouraged someone not to commit suicide and do something else. And that's hard to quantify. So I would argue that like right now, because chatbots are not designed to cause harm, they're probably neutral in their impact. They're not neutral for everybody. Some people they'll cause harm and some people they'll cause good. But to sort of go to the pessimistic take of tomorrow, what if you did in fact design a chatbot to encourage like people to do bad things? Like, what if you attempted to like weaponize this or control people's behavior? Or there's this term that's sometimes used called stochastic terrorism. You just post a lot about how a particular person needs to die, and you just reach enough people, and eventually you'll reach someone that's like deranged and will try to kill them. I think that some of that stuff gets more dangerous with chatbots because they are so like personal, and because people can form these like parasocial relationships with them. I think about slot machines. And slot machines are sort of this like very industrial, one size fits all attempt to manipulate human beings by providing a reward. Like they're not customized to attack my personal weaknesses. They're just like everyone that goes to Vegas, we have this model of the average human being and we've built a machine to target the average human being. But with chatbots, because they can be so personal and because people can form personal connections for them, like what's the post-industrial version of a slot machine that uses something like large language models? And like, how much harm can that do? I think that we should also ask how much good that can do. It is scary to think about. I've seen slot machines cause serious tragedy for people, and they're a very simple mechanism, and they still work. How much more power does something like GPT-4 have, especially if it is designed with a particular, with the intent of harm?
When you talk about being able to influence things with chatbots and just like saying something and then eventually some crazy does it or whatever, I mean, you have to wonder, like, are we eventually going to be in a world where nation states could introduce things into chatbots or OpenAI or language or the learning models, like, oh no, like we love dear China and our dear leader or whatever, and just like out of nowhere that could also be interesting, just subtly influencing, or if let's say they have a particular agenda, right?
We see this with like influence operations and like information operations, like on social media now, like the internet research agency that was run by Prigozhin in Russia, attempting to influence the election by just having a bunch of people at computers attempting to drive a particular narrative. And since human beings form beliefs often influenced by the perceived social consensus around them, that if you're on a forum and everyone's saying X, and that's where a lot of your social engagement is, it may bend you more towards X. It may not make you 100% believe them, but like you'll start to give it a little bit more credibility. Before chatbots, we saw these sorts of information operations, and early 20th century propaganda attempted the same thing even more crudely. But now when you like don't need a bunch of people in a room, but you can have that same megaphone of personal connection and personal interactions, but you can scale it up much larger. I think there's a lot of concern for how that could be used both inside authoritarian countries, but also like within like marketing campaigns. Like you're trying to sell a product and you have a bunch of chatbots that go and convince someone that they're talking to 30 people on a forum, and they're actually all just chatbots customized to make that person feel good and associate the product with goodness. Yeah, I think like there's a big danger there. On the positive side, I think these things conceivably could provide filters for that sort of thing. It's too early to see how that shakes out, and if there needs to be like what sort of like rules and norms we have about this.
That's going to be super interesting once chatbots human-like robots. Not to get too far. I think in Japan they actually have some to help old people or whatever, right? But if you put like a intelligent chatbot into one of those like robots that helps old people in China or whatever, right? You have to wonder how crazy stuff could get.
I mean, my phone, Google is constantly trying to get me to turn on Google Hello for my phone. I enjoy asking ChatGPT-4 questions, and I'm annoyed at Google Hello because Google's trying to make me talk to it. The sort of free-flowing conversation you can have with something like ChatGPT-4, it's no longer like an ad. It like just seeps into the conversation. It drops something, right? Like it's frightening. And then like humanoid robots also.
Yeah, for sure. Let's switch gears to the pick of the week. It could be anything from a website, a book, a movie, a TV show. It does not have to be security related. I'll start with mine. Mine is an FBI YouTube video. I was just kind of scouring their YouTube archive, and I came across something called Made in Beijing, the plan for global market domination. It really covers multiple instances of state-sponsored Chinese espionage, and it's very, very interesting. I don't want to spoil it. It's surprising how much China's trying to catch up and the lengths they're willing to go to. Ethan, what's yours?
So like one of my favorite blogs, a collection of unmitigated pedantry, ACOOP. That's acoop.blog. And it's this history professor, and he just writes these amazing, extremely detailed blogs that are very like approachable. I'm not a history academic, but I just get like lost in them. One of them he did a little while ago was about why the steam engine was invented in England and all of the threads there. A fascinating story. He really does his research and he really understands the subject matter. I generally keep it closed when I'm working because I'll just start reading it and His blog entries are fairly long. You just get sucked in and you're like 15 pages into like steam engines. It's wonderful.
I'll have to check that out. So a collection of unmitigated
pedantry.
How do you say it? Pedantry. Okay. That's acoup.blog. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. We're going to wrap up. Do you want to leave our listeners with any parting words of wisdom?
Trust but verify.
Prajem no prajev or whatever.
Oh yeah, I can never remember the Russian.
Prajem no prajev. Yeah, I'm probably butchering it. Yeah, that's a good one. Thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
If you liked the episode today and would like to help support us, please hit subscribe, drop us a review, or share it with your friends. Thanks.